Good morning, divas and dudes. So great to have you and joining me here on this beautiful fall morning at Powerhouse Bakery. We are in a series that is really so much fun, Tools of the Trade, and what gadgets that really work in the kitchen, and how do we make the most of our kitchen space, and really making sure that we have tools that make our job easier, and of course not so cumbersome. You know, sometimes gadgets, you think they sound really good and you watch an infomercial and you buy it and then you never get it out of the drawer because it's a pain to deal with. And so that's what I love to look through. Those of you that know me, I'm not very much of a gadget girl. I have just a few things, but you know, even doing this research, I've found things that I do actually really like, and I'm learning to use more. I think the bullet is probably one of my favorite new gadgets. Coming up soon, I'm going to show you the mandolin. So that'll be coming up in a while. But today, speaking of things that slice and dice, we are going to go over knives. So I'm going to guess a lot of us got a knife set either long ago when we were first married or as a wedding gift or something. And a knife set comes with certain things, right? And so the powers that be say, okay, well, we're going to sell this to the home cook. They don't really know what they're doing, probably. They're not chefs. So we're going to get the most out of their dollar, get their most of their dollars, I should say, and give them as many different knives as possible in order to help them spend as much money as possible. And then we'll go ahead and add a knife holder, and it may or may not actually protect their knives. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So I went home and I looked at my knives, and you know, I definitely am a foodie, and I saw that we have a set, and of course I got this one from my wonderful hubby. So I'm going to kind of go over the different knives and then show you what we do with them, and hopefully show you the best way to use them, knowing that probably 90% of your dicing and slicing is really going to only happen with one knife. And so I want us to pick what knife that's going to be and kind of why. And I hope by the end of the class you will have a whole fresh approach to picking a knife, and maybe even gifting knives in the future, how we would go about doing that. Is it really worth getting the set, or is it better spending money on, you know, one or two really good ones? And that's kind of where I'm hoping we'll go with this. So without further ado, which kind of knife am I holding? Any idea? Bread knife, yeah. The serrated edge definitely gives us an idea of having to slice into something that's pretty rough. Sure. So if we think of bread slicing, how many people slice bread these days? Yeah, a few of us. And that's because you might make bread from scratch. So yeah, no, I love that. What else could we use a serrated edge for? Any ideas? Yeah. So slicing anything that's going to have a rough edge. And so as we go through and use the knives, I just cooked off my spaghetti squash. And sometimes using a serrated edge makes it really easy to slice right through. Now you guys know my trick, right? This is not raw by any stretch, or I would not have been able to do that. I cooked this already, let it cool slightly. So yeah, I do like the serrated knife, and I like the length of this knife. So even if come Thanksgiving I want to slice my turkey, I could maybe even do that with this one. It's quite large. Notice the way I'm holding it. We're going to talk a lot about how to hold the knife, but the grip is really just the starting point. If you want to shake hands with the knife, it's going to come in to the little ridges that we've set up for it, but you almost always cinch up a little. You cinch up a little bit on the neck of the knife, which is where this area is. And some people have more of a comfort of farther back, but usually your thumb is going to be right in that metal area. It kind of gives you a guide. People that are not comfortable with knives will often go farther back. And we really want to think of it as an extension of our arm. So even like in karate, when I learned how to use my weapons in karate, it was the same idea. We want it to be very fluid motion. So even with a big slicer, we want that same thing to happen so that you can get in there and work a turkey or a spaghetti squash, as the case may be. The next one is going to be a little less obvious, and I've got two of them to show. This is actually not even in my knife set from my home. Now look at this. We've got a slight edge here. We still have the metal neck that we would hold on to when we take a hold of it and we get comfortable with it. Any idea what these knives would be for? Yeah, meat. Again, slicing or carving. The difference is that this one's got more of the angle. So it's going to allow us to slice down and go all the way to the base without our fingers running into whatever it is we're trying to cut. You know, if you run into your cutting board, that's no good. This is absolutely going to do that. It doesn't give me enough space, so my fingers will run into the table as I'm trying to get connection with the board. So this one's really only meant for carving. So a deboner is another one. So when it's a little bit smaller, it's narrow all the way to the back, and it's really meant to work in and around a bone. So when we do our deboning of the chicken in one of our next classes, you're going to get to see me kind of working through and boning, getting the flesh away from the bone. So that's really what this is for. If I have somebody in my kitchen and they grab this knife to slice an onion or a bell pepper, it's not going to work well at all because we don't get good connection with the board without it being too tight around our knuckles. So not a good choice for slicing or dicing. So really just for carving up and around. So when you're getting ready to carve your pumpkin, this style might be the right one. So same idea with this. So this really just a different size. So when you buy a set and it gives you one or two of these, that's superfluous. In my opinion, we don't need these very often. We might need one, but we could actually do almost the same jobs with our handy dandy bread slicer that will also do a really good job slicing meat. Will it debone? No. So it doesn't do that one. But there's another one of the set that actually will do that as well. And this is where we start getting into some fun. So here I'm showing you a beautiful all-purpose knife. In general, when we look at slicing and dicing, we definitely can go to about an 8 or 10-inch knife. This one's got enough of an angle here to keep my fingers away from the cutting board. And then we have our almighty paring knife. So you could work this one around a bone. You could also use the all-purpose knife that's fairly small. So again, I really like this one. So if you were going to get one knife for your, newlyweds, getting an 8 or 10-inch knife with a nice strong angle that has a nice sharp edge and enough working room to do some chopping, but also has some maneuverability to get around a bone, this would be a really great one. So it's kind of your all-purpose knife, and so I really like this one. The paring knife starts to have some beauty when you want to work with your thumb. So working a small amount of rind, you're working a little space. So you have to have some comfort level with your knife because you're going to work opposite of your thumb. So this one would never be something that you would slice through something because it's too small. So it's always in opposition to working around something. So if you were peeling an apple, it'd be a great way to pull that off and have a wonderful way to control that small blade and get all the little pieces of your rind or your apple peel off. So it's a great option for there. So then we come to our beautiful all-purpose knife. So this one is, again, this is my hubby's, so I didn't even pick this one, but I do like it a lot. It's got some nice weight to it. It's got ample neck It's got a good handle. And the trick is to always keep these knives as sharp as you can. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how to sharpen. But in general, when you find a knife that is, again, between 8 and 10 inches, it's got a little bit of point work in case you need to prick it before you slice it. That's a nice place to work. But 90% of your work is going to happen towards the back end. So the last 2/3 of the knife is where you're going to really do a lot of your work. And so this is a great one. If it feels heavy and uncomfortable, that's where it's really personal. You get to pick out one that you like. The handles vary a lot too. You can get one that's more sort of the Western style, and it'll be smooth on the handle. It may or may not have little grip edges, but for the most part, it's smooth. The Asian flare of knives now has multiple ridges around it, and it just gives a different feel. My humble opinion, having lots of ridges is not going to really help because you don't want your hand to be moving around. If your hand is wet or you're working with, poultry and you're slimy, well, go wash and dry, because even if it's got a lot of ridges, you don't want to have risk of it slipping. So in my opinion, you would get a fancy handle just for the fun of it. There isn't really any functionality that I can find in one that has lots of ridges all the way around it. So again, personal. Another thing that's really valuable when you're looking for a knife is how it's made. So all of these, and it's pretty easy to find these days, are going to have the metal piece that goes all the way through the handle. Does anybody know somebody that used to sell Cutco? I used to sell Cutco. It's so fun. My very first job as a salesperson. And they would mention that as an important quality, that you really, to have a high quality knife, you want to have ample connection of the handle to the metal. So kind of cool. The higher grade knives will have a heavier metal that won't lose its edge quickly. And so lots of variations of steel, but for the most part, you want one that's going to hold its edge for a good amount of time. And so when we start doing some of the slicing, it should feel good in the grip. It should give you enough space so that you can really work your veggies. And you know me, I'm more veggie than meat. And you don't really need to have a meat slicer versus a veggie slicer. They should all be about the same qualities: a good size, a good handle, a nice weight that feels good, and it should feel like you can really maneuver it well. So now when I do some slicing, I'm going to first start with the tip in contact with the cutting board. And so, as you know, when you're first starting out, and I know that none of you guys are novices. Can you see okay? Having the tip down gives you a really good anchor. So I'm working the back of the blade and I'm gliding it. So down and forward, down and forward. And notice that my grip is not a tight grip like a handshake. It's soft, and I use the pointer and the thumb to kind of hold it in place. And so it's quite a science, but you get to a point where you're comfortable maneuvering those fingers to really get better detailed grip. And the other part that's really important is what the other hand is doing. So forming the claw is really important. You want to have the fingers touching the board so that the knuckles can protrude a little bit, so that when I'm slicing, the edge of the knife, the top edge, is in contact or very close. So that, what does that mean? The blade never is in contact with the fingers. So we, make sure that we don't make contact. Some chefs will do a glide motion and get really fast at it, and that becomes their comfort level. I've had chefs here at the bakery that have thought it be more valuable to do a tapping. So now with a wooden board, it's not as hard on the blade, but anytime we make that sound, in my mind, I'm thinking getting duller, 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 duller. So I prefer not to do the tapping. Some believe that if you have a high enough quality knife, you can cut through fast with a loud tapping, and it will not actually dull in the knife too much. But, before every use, knowing how to sharpen the knife is going to help us minimize that risk. So to really sharpen, the edge of your sharpener needs to be touching the table, and I'm going to form an angle as I glide forward and back. Forward and back, and I'm putting quite a bit of pressure forward and back. And so the angle that we're looking for when we're sharpening, if this is the blade, we want this is my sharpening iron, I'm sorry. We want the knife to come in at a slight angle. So it's going down and out, down and out, down and out. And this is about a 30-degree angle when you're slicing through. Now I know it's hard to know exactly what 30 degrees is, but when you get somebody that's really good at it, you can hear the right sound that you're going for. Now, some of them will look for an oil. You can use a flat stone. These oftentimes come with your set, and it sits in there in that little block, and you think, well, I don't know what you do with that thing. Just leave it there. And so the chefs that, again, love to tap to cut know this very well, so they don't let their knives get too dull, because once you get them past a certain point, this will hardly work. You'll almost have to go to a professional slicer. So I bring my husband in, and he plugs it in and really works it if we need to get to that point. But this one is so nice to glide it across, and you just need about 6 or 7 licks, they call it, on each side, and then wipe it off, and then your knife is ready to use again. So again, I kind of like to hold stable and slice and rock. I notice that when I have a brand new baker or chef in my kitchen, that's awkward for them. They want to go straight down and not glide. So I try to help them imagine that it's a rocking motion, and some of the knives make that easy because there's a little bit of an angle. That's a great knife because it helps you get that rhythm and flow. It should be easy on the wrist. It should not be uncomfortable to do that glide. Notice that on some of these there is no angle at all. So right away, this one has more ergonomics to be able to do that slicing technique. There are some knives, and I don't have one today to show you, that would be an Asian style that's very thick, and it doesn't have an angle at all, and that's really meant for chopping in this fashion. That's not the way I was trained, but of course it would work. But you'd have to, again, be really careful to keep the edge sharp, because if you're going to do a lot of chopping, it's going to dull in that area. And so then you get out your sharpener and you work it again and make sure that edge is nice and sharp. It's kind of a misnomer that sharp knives are dangerous. Sharp knives are safer than a dull knife, because if you're working it, trying to cut a tomato, you sure don't want to have to work through it and risk hurting yourself. Most of the accidents that happen with knives is when they're being washed. And so the other thing I always say is knives are never part of the party. They never get to go to the dish room. They are always handled separately. Kind of like the king and the queen of the kitchen, they get handled separately. And so they never get put into the dishwasher, of course, and they never get put into a pan of water, because you could easily reach in there. And so every once in a while that happens at the bakery, and we make them do 50 push-ups because we don't want that accident to happen and hurt somebody. So now what I want to do is show you a couple of cuttings. Now I did give you a recipe, so we're going to assemble some of those ingredients because it's so fun to get to apply what we're learning. But first, what I want to do is attack the spaghetti squash. So I cut off the ends with my serrated knife, and now I'm going to use my deboner, right, or my slicer. And again, because it's up in the air, it kind of works. I can slice right through it, and that's kind of what I would do if I were working a piece of meat, or if I was getting ready to debone. But let's face it, we don't want to have to wash 5 different knives. And so the beauty is that this guy will do so much, especially when it's long enough to cut through, and I'm keeping it sharp in the full range of the blade, so I can do a lot of work in it. So now that I've got my spaghetti squash open, this is where this one's kind of a pain. It's a little too thick to work around the seeds. So I am going to pick out my next favorite, which is still going to have that wonderful versatility, but it's a little smaller. It's a little more easy to manage. So when I get my seeds out, and I'm going to pull this aside so you can see. a little bit better. What I want to show you is how I pull the seeds away with my hand. So it's still a little bit warm, but I'm using this tiny little section of the knife to scrape the silk away from the flesh. So I'm giving it a little slice. The place where it's connected the most is at the end, so I'm pulling that. And each little section, you can start to see all the seeds that are connected to that silk start to pull away. Do it this side, so I'm pulling it. It's still a little warm, so I'm gonna just pull it with the knife. But this kind of work is beautiful. If I was gonna do this one, it kind of works, but it doesn't dig in there quite as well. So again, if I were gonna pick one knife, it would probably be this size. This one, so again, the slicer, it'll work. I can kind of work it around. And see, notice how the pointer comes in right away to try to guide it a little bit. That's the only time that the pointer comes out, is when I'm doing detailed work, trying to get seeds away, or if I was trying to carve the pulp out of a tomato. Because most of the time that index finger should stay in securely. To make sure that it's ergonomic and it's comfortable, I want to make sure that this finger stays in. Now it can go up towards the neck a little bit. Again, I'm going to hold it with the index and the thumb to give myself good stability of the knife. But for the most part, I don't want that pointer to come out in front. That definitely gives us lots of exposure to that index finger, and so I can tell that when I have a new chef in the bakery, they are just not comfortable with a knife yet. Also, it might be that their hand isn't quite strong enough, and so that again tells me the knife should be stronger, should be sharper, so that the hand is not having to push into the cutting exercise. It should really do all the work on its own. So, even with a tomato, it should just glide right through. We should not have to push through or poke it with the tip and then cut. Sometimes that happens, but for the most part, if you find you're doing that, it probably means the knife needs to get a lot sharper, and that way it's a really nice cutting experience, and you don't have to run the risk of poking yourself or cutting yourself. So let's go back to this guy. And again, I'm going to use my favorite one. I'm pulling those seeds across. Now, the spaghetti squash is not in your recipe. Today we're doing a recipe for lettuce wraps, and some of the most important items in this recipe are things you're going to use all the time. So onion, of course some citrus, and garlic, of course. But I wanted you to see some of the multi-uses of knives. And spaghetti squash is something we always do at Powerhouse Bakery. We're always pulling it apart, and I realize that there's a technique and it becomes really natural, but at first it's kind of cumbersome. So that's how beautiful it comes out. And from this stage, we would take a fork and start to pull all those beautiful shreds out and make our beautiful spaghetti squash salad. So of course, I'm using the tongs here, but your fork will do a great job. But I love having the spaghetti squash. And usually the first stage of going, gosh, do I really want to have spaghetti squash, is how hard it is to cut this. And you could cut it raw and put it in water. Some of the recipes will say cut it and put it in hot water, or put it in water and cook it by the half. If you have a strong enough knife, you can absolutely cut through it raw. But why do that if we don't have to? So as you know, my trick is I put the whole butternut into the oven, cook it for about 35 minutes, let it cool. And I cooked this just before you all came, so it's still warm, but it's not so hot that I can't manage it. And it's so nice to be able to work with it that way. So it gives us lots of flexibility.
Do you have to poke it with a fork?
No, the question is, do you have to poke it with a fork? And no, you don't. The hardest thing I think about the spaghetti squash is knowing when it's done. So I'll pass this around because I want you to feel it. It feels still firm. If you undercook a spaghetti squash, you can always cook it a little bit more, that way, which is put it in some water upside down. But you can't bring it back to life. And so if you poke holes in it, it will drain and be a miserable cleanup on your stove. So the trick is, it shouldn't go that far in the cooking. You pull it off before it, even starts to leak. And then it's very easy to work with. On the other hand, the butternut squash, because oftentimes, we make that into a soup and we do want it really soft, then it is worth poking some holes and putting it on a baking pan so that all that dripping doesn't get onto your stove. Because you definitely want that to be soft enough, and you sure don't want it to be in your oven base. But great question. Okay, so now what I want to do is get some of our ingredients together for our recipe. And so, again, lettuce wraps are so fun and versatile. The ingredients you can put in lots of different things. So what I've done here is I browned some ground turkey, and then I added jalapeno, some onions, and of course I added to the recipe a little celery or bell pepper. You could even have fresh sliced tomatoes to go along with it. And the lettuce wrap is just a lovely way to have kind of a low carb meal. And then of course, if you want, you can add potatoes and all kinds of other good complex carbohydrates. But I picked this recipe because so often these items are what we find ourselves having to cook or cut. So onion, jalapeno, and of course our all favorite garlic. And you know that I do use garlic pulp sometimes, and I really love ginger pulp. So those are workable, but there's nothing like fresh garlic. So I really emphasize using fresh garlic as much as you can. So now if I go back to my favorite knives, this one for most of my chopping and slicing, and even my little small one, there are some pros and cons to having one that's a little more beefy. And that's really with garlic, because here I've got my quite large garlic clove, and I'm going to slice off the ends. I like to first make sure there isn't any green, and so that's nice and white. I love that. So yay, that's a good garlic. If I have this knife, it's a little harder to crack and press open the paper, and so that makes it harder to get off. This one's got a little more meat around it, so it makes it a lot easier, and then the papers come right off. So sometimes that size makes a big difference. And this one is still a little bit wet, and so the paper still didn't come off very well. There's some great tricks to getting all the paper off, but usually just pressing with the knife is enough to do it. So now I've got my beautiful clove, and what I want to do next is use my great technique for getting this garlic clove sliced. It does help to press it again and get some of those juices liberated. So the smaller garlic will have a different flavor sometimes, be more or less spicy. So garlic really is a fun one to pick and decide which kind is going to be your favorite. The elephant garlic is quite large. It tends to be a little more mild in flavor. But having said that, I've had some and it seems really spicy. You could even go with a shallot that is kind of a cross between an onion and a garlic, not literally, but the flavor and the whole feel of the vegetable. But garlic cloves should be beautifully shaped, should have a light purple color, and of course we don't want the garlic clove to be sprouting. That's always not desirable. So once we get it all ready and peeled, I'm going to again use my claw. I can use the claw approach with the index finger or the middle finger. With garlic, I tend to use the index finger because it's a smaller vegetable. But again, you're going to find your own comfort level. And I'm watching the blade go into the garlic at each slice. So my eyes are keeping it in place. If you're doing the tap, you're not necessarily keeping your eye on it because of the quick movement. So again, I kind of think it's safer to do the slice method with the tip down. Once we do the initial slice, then we're going to turn it a quarter turn and slice it one more time. And you might have seen me use my hand to glide everything in. Once you get a lot of chop going, you want to still keep it all in one spot and keep it close together, so every time you make a slice, you're making good contact with each piece of your vegetable. So I glide it and I slide the vegetable off, going from the top down, and get everything chopped into the fine dice that I'm looking for. Now when it comes to jalapeno, what I've done here is I've just cut it in half first, this is where this knife is going to be a little tough because it's so large and I want to get all those seeds out without it burning my hands too much, or of course getting into the dish if I don't want it to be that spicy. So then this knife does come in pretty handy. I can bring out the index finger, start to glide around the pith, which is the white kind of fibrous section in the center, and just use the tip of the knife to glide through those pieces and get them all off. So now that's a really nice sliced jalapeno ready for chopping. And it's kind of set up so that sliced first in long thin pieces works well. And here's my claw, so I'm holding the jalapeno just with the very end of my finger, and then I'm going to turn it a quarter turn, line them up, and slice again. So both of these vegetables are little. You know, it's different if you have a cucumber or a zucchini where there's a lot of space. With these smaller vegetables, you know, you just are going to decide if you want a larger knife or a smaller one. And again, not having to get a lot of knives dirty, you probably will settle in on one, and even if it's a little bit cumbersome to, you know, clean out the seeds with your larger knife, it still works just fine. You can work that around and get really good at moving it. But don't be afraid to pick it up and kind of get comfortable with maneuvering into those smaller spaces. So there is my beautiful jalapeno. Now for the onion. So if you have never watched professionals do onion, it's so interesting to see the variations. And you know, through the years, I've had lots of different folks coming in and showing off their skills. And the onion is always kind of the epitome of what do we get to watch them do. So once we get the initial papers off, what we're going to do is just practice the slicing technique. We don't really have to worry about how the onion's cut, except that I want you to have knife safety in mind. Some chefs will go to great lengths to slice it first horizontally and then slice it through, and then you get these perfect little pieces. I never really perfected that, so I'm going to show you the style that I do. I slice pieces fairly thin, so it allows me to get a pretty thin initial slice, and then I turn it a quarter turn, just like I've done with the jalapeno and the garlic. So even though this vegetable is a little bigger, I just line it up, use my claw method, the tip stays down, and it turns out really good. So I am holding the slices with that top claw hand, and it works out great. So I've often done slicing competitions with my interns to see who gets the better cuts, the quicker time, and no blood. No, just kidding. But it comes out about the same. So it's always just about, you know, how tight or how small do you want your dice. And for the most part, I don't like tiny little dice. I don't like anything that looks institutional. So I always tease my staff that I want kind of uneven pieces because it looks more homemade. And if we have chefs that come in that are classically trained, and they're probably in their history been judged on how neat and tidy their little quarter-inch dice can be, to me that sounds like an institution, and it seems so I don't know, just not homey. So I prefer to have a little bit less even cuts, but I'm still getting the same effect. I still get a nice small cut. There's some pieces that are maybe a little bit bigger, and the easy thing to do there is just to go through it a couple more times with the knife, which is why I do tend to have my pile close together. I use the flat hand, and I'm just pushing the vegetable towards the blade and getting a really nice cut. And I do have a good speed to it, good fluidity, because I'm sliding it forward rather than the chopping. And gosh, when you get too much going, you can actually lose some of your veggie too because it splashes. So I think the quick tap will work probably best if you want to perfect it with mushrooms or strawberries. They don't seem to fly off as much as the smaller diced vegetables like bell pepper and onion. So, to me, that's the best way to do onion. So now I'm going to show you one more, and it is the beautiful bell pepper. So when we start with the pepper, there's two ways. Oftentimes folks will cut off both ends, then take out the pith, and then you have the outside that you can put in nice little strips. So I'll show you that first, but it's not typically the way I've done it. Mainly because it lends itself to throwing this away. And if you've bought bell peppers anytime soon, we don't want to waste anything. But of course, you can take out the center and save this for a chop. And you know, the nice thing too is once you do take off the tops, you can just peel off the pith, or you can take one of your smaller knives and just gently cut that out. I do a little V cut, and it helps just get rid of that pith without cutting through the whole piece of the pepper. Now I've got a nice long one, and I can make beautiful strips if I'm going to be doing my street tacos and I want to have beautiful strips. Also, we can use the strips to stack and beautifully make the little tiny cuts. If we wanted to do an omelet where it makes sense to have tidy little pieces, we don't want to have too big of a bite of anything in our omelet, I'm going to show you how we can stack them. So here I've got all the veggies lined up soldier style, right? And so now I'm just going to turn them a quarter turn, and now I can go through and make these perfectly 1/4 inch dice. And you can see how little the cuts are. If we really want to, right, we can do it. But I wouldn't worry about it again if I'm making a chili or a ratatouille or a sofrito. I kind of like the big au naturel cuts. Now, let me show you one other thing. So here's the orange one I did. The seed is still there, so I'm just going to pull it off. And of course, whenever I'm teaching my team that time is essential, I can even stack these and cut them really quick. So if it's a turkey chili or it's the bison chili or something where the cuts aren't as critical, I'm going to stack them 4s, turn them a quarter, use my claw and cut through, and I get these beautiful slices that are all really evenly cut. Really nice. So stacking them, slicing them together works great. Of course, I could do the quarter turn, get them in the even size cubes if I wanted to. And then these little guys we don't want to forget about. So I can cut them into a dice, and the odd shapes kind of disappear that way. So I'm again using that big knife, and I'm getting a nice even dice. Now the tomato, this is the one where people love to really test the sharpness of a knife by, you know, sliding through it with it just sitting on the counter. Have you seen that happen? You know, and it's really fun because the skin of the tomato is always the toughest part, and especially if you've got a small tomato, you want to be able to go through it very delicately without pressing out the pulp of the tomato. Once you get the tomato cut in half, I mean, certainly you can use the cut side down and get a beautiful cut if your knife is nice and sharp. If it's dull, you're going to press on the tomato, right, and then lose some of the shape and of course the juice. If your knife isn't as sharp as you want it to be, opening the top, so cutting it from the open side up, of course makes it a lot easier. Cut side down, you're having to access the skin first, and of course it's a little harder to do. But tomatoes are always the really important part of your knife skills, and that's getting comfortable with how to slice the tomato. When I have a brand new baker, I do encourage them to have as much surface area on the cutting board as possible. So this is going to be more surface area than this. The problem is, like I mentioned, cutting a tomato from the skin side top is going to be a little tougher. So I have to teach them how to glide the knife across rather than pressing it. If I'm pressing the knife across, of course, not much is happening except for denting the tomato. So it's a really delicate touch where you're slicing across and not really putting any pressure. So that one's an important element there. Okay, so now what I want to do is another little chop. of our cilantro. So in what I've shown us so far, we're really using most of the vegetable. Of course, I've taken out the seeds or I've taken off the skin. With cilantro, it depends again on what you're cooking, but for the most part, I don't like to use the center rib. The leaves are going to be the most important piece. Now, if I really did a lot of fine chopping, we could probably get this down enough so that it wouldn't really matter in flavor. But I kind of disagree. I like to take that center rib out at first. There are some gadgets out there that will pull the leaves right off, and it'll be like a little gadget. You'd have to go to your drawer and find that gadget and see if it would work, and then half the time it doesn't really work. You guys know what I'm talking about? It's a destemmer, and it's meant for things like thyme, where the little delicate leaves are supposed to be stripped off with this little gadget. I didn't even bring it in to show you. But I do love the fact that fresh herbs are so much better when they're the delicate fresh leaf and not a lot of the other stuff, the stem. So how do we really get this into a nice fine dice? So we know for sure that we're going to want one of our chopping knives. We don't want one that is going to run into the table, because my knuckles are going to hit the table before I ever make contact. So, we know that right away. But I've had people in my kitchen grab something like this and just use their tip. Just using the tip. And that's like not very effective. Even if you don't have the stems in your mix of herbs, using the tip is not efficient. The only time we ever use the tip is when we're really wanting to carve. So like I showed you here, carving out the seeds, or if we are working a tomato and we want to just get the stem out and we're just working the tip. So just remember that. That's the only thing that the tip is good for. And of course, we still want it to be really sharp because we want to be able to do the job. By Irene. But we don't want to try to cut with that tip. So we're going to pick our heavy duty one or our little bit lighter version. Again, I still kind of go to this one because look at the difference in the blade. One's got a rocking motion kind of built into it and one doesn't. The true French chef's knife does not. This is more of an Asian flair, but they're both really fun. So this one I feel grip the leaves a little bit more when I chop down, because it stops right when it touches the surface, versus this one allows me to roll through, and it just feels good because I can feel it slicing through, and it's a really ergonomic motion. And so I'll use my flattened hand to get even more chopping done. I'm using the full space of the knife so that all of the leaves are getting into a fine dice. And there we go. So that looks really pretty, really fine. I might chop through this area a little bit more, but again, it's okay to have pieces that are a little bit more size, because then you get a little different mouthfeel and even the flavor adjusts really nicely. Beautiful. Notice that I do wipe from the top quite often and then take it off my hand. So it's a really smooth motion and I'm not getting anywhere near the blade. Anytime I'm scraping off of the cutting board, I'm using the back, not the blade, because I want to keep it preserved as much as I can. So I'm sliding, I'm moving, I'm organizing my cutting board. And so again, using the full tool of the knife is really helpful. The smaller one is a little harder to do because I've got a little angle on there. So, pros and cons. This one's got a lot of maneuverability, but I can't use it as a tool nearly as well. So you might find when you're knife shopping, you might decide that you do want the rocking motion, but you might want one that's a little smaller. There's plenty of knives out there, and it's so fun to be able to collect some of this style, because you're going to do the majority of the work there, and then every once in a while find a paring knife and a slicer that will do multi jobs. And again, this one is really great if I was gonna carve a pumpkin. Of course, I'm really with a lemon, I can really go through and de-rind the lemon or the lime, and I can even work around the pith, and I'm really getting in there with the tip because it's nice and sharp, and I'm able to get all the little squeeze membranes right out of that lime. So I love that. And I do this with apples. If I was going to do a baked apple, I could cut right through the skin and get right into the center of the pith and the seeds, and it becomes a really handy tool. But other than that, I don't use a paring knife very often. Anybody else? Anybody have any suggestions about a paring knife? No? Anybody use a paring knife? Sometimes? Yeah? Yeah, so I feel like once in a while you'll use that one. This one you probably will use a little more often because as homemakers and as home chefs, we most likely are going to cut meat, cut into a spaghetti squash, and of course homemade bread. But you could use some of these other ones for bread too if you had to. So let me go over the recipe before we run out of time so you can sample everything too. And I'm going to share with you some of the variations that I did in the one that we get to sample today, because it's always fun to have little something customized. In the recipe that I gave you, I'm suggesting a blender to add in your chopped jalapeno and cilantro. So you're going to have to pre-chop it just a little bit and mix up with your favorite yogurt, and that's going to be the sauce. And then your lime juice. So we learned last week the zester. Did anybody find a zester to purchase? Or you probably already have one. But a zester is an absolutely critical tool of the trade. And so with our Thai lettuce wraps, I did pick some really cute little lettuce leaves too for our sample today. These are just beautiful because they're so handy. But of course you could use any kind of romaine or butter lettuce and even pre-roll them for your guests. It becomes really fun. The ground cumin, lime juice. So we're going to use a blender as our tools of the trade. We're going to use a zester. And of course a French chef's knife. I'm putting that in quotes because, again, not all have to have the same characteristics of a French chef's knife, but any kind of chef knife that is going to be good for chopping, because that's where you're going to do your main production of all the veggies that are going to go in it. You could use soy sauce, a little bit of water. Of course, the scallions I didn't have today, but I put the peppers in place because it's so pretty and bright. And know that you can always add extra veggies to this, because I think that, you know, the base is your meat and your base flavors are going to be the lime juice and the cumin, a little bit of garlic and jalapeno, and then the rest could kind of be a fun variation of what you're feeling like including. And I think always adding the tomato is such a nice addition because that's a bright color and it gives a lot of extra moisture too. So once you serve it, having the lettuce around the edge and then the center for your guests to scoop the meat mixture on, and then having on the side your spaghetti squash, because that one is also going to use a tool of the trade. And of course the big slice knife will help us get into it. And then also remember, kind of the tool of the trade there is cooking method. And so preheating the oven, putting the whole thing into the oven and letting it soften is such a great way to cook this. So bake for about 30 minutes at 350. Gets it nice and soft. So then using any one of your knives, but probably that big slicer, and you'll cut off the ends of it first, kind of like what I did here, cutting the ends off, and then it allows you to really work around the seeds and the silk so that then the flesh is really accessible. And then using your fork or, you know, really any of your tools are going to help you get all those beautiful strands of the squash out for your salad. So that'd be a great side dish to go with your lettuce wraps. So there you have it. So bon appetit. Yay.